the total lack of stability and the misery of exile for all royals. I mean, if you're royal and then you don't actually have any money or around, what is the point of you? And you can't just extinguish that entitlement. I don't think so. Okay, we'll just become a plumber. I'm a prince today, I'll be a plumber tomorrow. I'll just get on with it. It doesn't work like that when you've got this inbuilt genetic entitlement. As Philip reminded people when they were being really rude to him in Buckingham Palace, actually, my grandmother was born in Windsor Castle.
Hello and welcome to this week's pod. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. Today I welcome back a good friend of the show, Dr. Tessa Dunlop, to talk about her wonderful new book, Elizabeth and Philip, the story of young love, marriage and monarchy. Now, I've never been hugely interested in the modern royal family, but since the Queen's death and learning about her early life, and in particular Philip's, their story speaks to a turbulent time in European history. This is very much being captured in Tessa's book. The Philip that so many of us know is that of the irascible Duke of Edinburgh, a curmudgeonly royal who would make off-colour jokes and questionable driving decisions. But his upbringing and youth made him a much more complicated and interesting character than that presented in the newspapers. He was born in Corfu as a member of the Greek royal family, and his 4 sisters married senior members of German aristocracy, and 2 of those seem to have been Nazi party members. Now, this pod is going out in the middle of the recent Netflix documentary, and so inevitably Tessa and I discuss contemporary events. I've watched, or started to watch, Volume 1 of the Harry and Meghan show, so you don't have to, and my advice is don't. But what I would say is that reading Tessa's book and our discussion today has made me realise that the background of the royal family is far more complex than the celebrity-dominated news stories of today. And it's one of the reasons why it made my Books of the Year list. I've put a link in the show notes for Aspects of History's Books of the Year, and of course Tessa's, and you can find her on the Twitter. Now, following on from last week, which of you picked up on the editing mishap? Well, that's been rectified, but I want to reassure you that those responsible have been fired, and so I can promise you it will never happen again. I have to own up to a misquote as well in my recent chat with Lawrence Friedman. Amma in Romania got in touch to pick me up on the line, L'état, c'est moi, which was of course said by Louis XIV, the Sun King, not Napoleon. Thank you, Amma, for pointing that out. Funnily enough, it's something Napoleon might have said, and in the movie Waterloo, starring the great Rod Steiger as the Corsican ogre, he does say a line that sounds close. I am France, and France is me. But that's Hollywood, not history, and I'm correcting the record. Coming up, I've got Ian McGregor on Stalingrad. Peter Hughes discusses history today. I've got a top 10 historical movies with a Hollywood director. Slight exaggeration, he's certainly a director. And I'm working on top 10 historical events of Christmas, so do subscribe. I'm offering a discount to annual subscriptions of the eMag down from $9.99 to only £5 for the year. The code is History50%, and I've put that in the show notes as well. Until then, I'll hand you over to me and Tessa Dunlop talking Elizabeth and Philip. Tessa Dunlop, the author of Elizabeth and Philip. Welcome back. You're becoming a bit of a permanent presence here on the podcast. But this is your new book. I mean, you're churning them out. This is the second.
No, Ollie, stop. I
What?
mean, I rely on you as a friend and also as the esteemed editor of Aspects of History magazine to always get all accreditations correct. But you never refer to a writer as churning them out. That makes it sound like garbage. This was a
second book published in 2 years running.
Yeah, Dan Jones will tell you that you have to write a book a year to make a living.
Yes.
That's the reality. And this time it was the first time I had the honor of actually employing someone, because I was close to the wind time-wise, and I employed an extremely good postdoctorate individual, Dr. Jack Clift, who hadn't got his fellowship that he wanted, so had a month. And he dived into the newspaper archive with me at the British Library. There are many writers who never admit to ever getting any research help. But I'm so proud that I was able to engage somebody meaningfully in a library and pay them honestly that I'm telling everyone. And also he was brilliant. He was really good. I mean, 120 pages of meticulously recorded information from mainly the British tabloid press in the 1940s and 50s. Because I discovered, Ollie, between you and me, a lot of royal books, biographers are slapped out, generally by journalists or certainly non-historians. And there is a bit of a cut and paste thing that goes on. Often they have a sort of friend who's a royal or an insider who gives them a bit of an exclusive. And then it's all stitched together, which is fine, but it doesn't really add to our knowledge. And I think some tropes get repeated. One, and I won't call out the individual, although I do call him out in my book, quite an established writer, and certainly his biography on the Queen sold well, saying that, really they weren't bothered by the press at all in the 40s and 50s. It was anodyne, the way in which the press covered the royals. And that I discovered in relation to Elizabeth and Philip, which is the book we're talking about. Brilliant Indeed. Book, by the way. Much better than Giles Brandreth's The Queen. I'm no crony. No, I don't pretend that the Queen and Philip were my friends. But I can tell you they were given a bit of a rough ride in the late 40s. Britain didn't want Little Britain post-Second World War, having been exposed to the ravages of 2 world wars. We didn't want a foreign prince marrying into our British royal family. It's so interesting how quickly that changed. Between the 19th century, when you have global Britain, imperial Britain, Victoria's progeny splashed all over Europe, suddenly in 2 world wars, you have those progeny fighting each other, if not literally on the battlefield, as ancient kings or medieval kings did, certainly their countries fighting each other. And that very much changes the definition of what monarchy is. And it makes Philip suspiciously beautiful and suspiciously poor, attached to the suspicious Greek monarchy, undesirable.
And so the tabloids then, from the Second World War, they become a little bit more parochial. They're not so keen on foreigners. And
the tabloids don't a little bit more parochial. The problem is, I mean, if you think of the sort of Beaverbrook Press, Express conglomerate, they sold like the Express back then 2.5 million circulation. This was a big deal. And of course, the Daily Mail was the first 1 million circulation at the beginning of the 20th century. So they're always quite thumpy, very patriotic, hugely royal, these papers. Is that parochial? I think it's more patriotic. I suppose in terms of where Britain globally used to be positioned, it's parochial. But
yeah, I guess they weren't really moving from a position. They always had that, I suppose.
I think they've remained consistent. There is a wonderful consistency about the position of the Express and the Mail that hasn't really shifted, insofar as Brits are the best. They're unapologetic about that, and I think have been since the get-go, since the beginning of the 20th century. And it's that relationship I don't know if you picked up on that. Did you read the book?
Yes, of course. I always read the books when I interview people. I did, and actually, I found. I love the Queen. Everyone loves the Queen. She's, wonderful and all that. But I found Philip a lot more of an interesting character. And his upbringing is very interesting. And I was going to ask you, because you mentioned his sort of poverty. Yeah, of course.
To say now that
well, I've never, in all honesty, I've never really been that interested in the private lives of the royal family.
Yeah.
They've just always been there, and I haven't really been. I'm not particularly a royalist. It's sort of there in the background. And with the Queen's death, though, I've got more interested in it. So I started reading it after she died, because that's when it came out, and I just found his background really fascinating. His mother, I find fascinating. His sisters, who marry rather questionable indivials.
Well, are they questionable? I mean, they are questionable, but arguably the main reason.
Well, they're Nazis.
Well, I know. Well, indeed.
You comfortable with
millions
Nazis?
Of Germans. They married German men.
Yeah.
That's the truth. To upper class, top drawer German men who are incorporated into the Nazi regime. On a couple of them. So
I think they were Nazi party members, weren't they?
Yeah, there was a couple, and the. Cecile's husband, Hess, at his funeral, because they were wiped out in a plane crash in 1937, Goring
Yes.
was at the funeral. So there you have British royalty hanging out at a funeral. I mean, this is 1937. We haven't yet got our backs to the wall. We're not at war, but the divisions were very apparent even then, that this was a challenging period. Philip is interesting in that respect, and that he has. I also found Mountbatten a fascinating character, because you have the schizophrenia within Philip's family, which of course is a direct result of Europe becoming so divided in the first half of the 20th century, means that on the one hand, his 4 sisters, one dying, of course, but the remaining 3 all married to men who fight for the fatherland, who fight for Germany. But then you have Mountbatten, who's done everything he can, and his family have done everything they can to kind of anglicize the Battenbergs, German, effectively. And Philip, although he's attached to the Greek throne, he's 6th in line to the Greek throne, it's German blood coursing through his veins that actually disturbs our political class and our courtiers.
And Mountbatten was his uncle, wasn't he?
And Mountbatten was his uncle. So he was attached to the renamed Milford Havens. And because the Battenberg, the original Battenberg, who was admiral in the First World War, had to step down because of his German associations. So they'd undergone this whole rebranding, and there was no way Mountbatten was going to let it happen again, that one of his own kith and kin were going to be sidelined because of their questionable genetics or blood or nationality. I mean, how does one talk about these things now? It's kind of bizarre, isn't it, just how much has changed. But and that meant that he did everything he could to get Philip naturalized. Again, this is fascinating, isn't it? That you have to be a naturalized Brit. I mean, imagine if we'd said to Meghan Markle, give up your American passport, become a Brit before you marry Harry, which is basically what happened to Philip. He was homogenized into the great British system, including his faith. Of course, he was an Orthodox Greek. So it's all bells and smells and chanting, and suddenly he's straitjacketed into the Anglican Church, poor bugger.
How seriously did he take the Greek Orthodox religion?
Well, of course, I think he wore it fairly lightly. Don't forget, he was educated predominantly, certainly the latter part of his education, but even indeed in his prep school was in England. So, and then he has a brief stint in Germany, and then he comes across to Gordonston, and he spends a lot of his holidays itinerary either with his cousin Marina, who's the Duchess of Kent, she's married to the Duke of Kent, or with his uncle Mountbatten, always in a sort of itinerant camping status. But in both families, his own, where he's the only son, the longed for son after 4 daughters, who comes late, arrives 6 or 7 years after his youngest sister. But so he's got the revered male status in that family, and he also has a revered male status because Mountbatten never had a daughter, and because Mountbatten never had a son. So there is, and I think that explains. One biographer refers to it as his penis-all, Prince Philip's penis-all, this idea that he has this very self-aware and heightened idea of his own masculine prowess. He's quite pleased with himself, Philip, in a conventional male way. And I think that's partially explained by his very precious status as this only boy, both in the Mountbatten family and in his own family.
So he wasn't an insecure individual, despite his...
Oh, no. In no way was he insecure. But I found a fascinating book written in the 1980s. It's out of print now, but there's a copy in the British Library. And I really did read that like as it was a page turner. And it was written by Eileen Parker, the wife of Mike Parker, who was a lieutenant alongside Philip in World War II. They became very good friends. And he was, of course, later, inculcated in the scandal where he has an affair and therefore he has to step down as the private secretary. But they remained close from World War II right through to that scandal in 1957 and in contact thereafter. But Parker, I was always fascinated by Eileen's story too. She's sort of a slightly bosomy Scot, Eileen Parker, and her father went to the same school that I went to in Scotland, Strathallan. Anyway, so
it's very posh school, isn't it?
Not very, but it trains up Scottish rugby players. Most of the Scotland's first 15 go to Strathallan now. They didn't in my day, but they do now. Anyway, the Fergusons, I'm good friends with the Fergusons' uncle. It's a very small pool, Scotland. Anyway, Eileen marries Mike Parker, best friends of Philip in World War II, so sees and gets to know Philip before he becomes prince and associated with Elizabeth. And she said he was very aware of his special status and used to sign himself always Prince Philip of Greece. there was no doubting that. And that was the other thing that's, I think you'll agree, Ollie, special about my book, as you're not going to say it, I'm just putting those words into your mouth, my friend. Yeah,
It is special.
That it is special that my old women that I've worked with in all my other books gave me wonderful insights into either personally into Prince Philip and Elizabeth, the stories associated with them in the war, or alternatively insights into what it was like to date and get married at that time. And Pamela, who was a Bletchley girl who I always adored, she always told me stories of Prince Philip of Greece, because she was at Bletchley Park, in fact was the boss of Osla Benning, who was Prince Philip's girlfriend, very famously. And if you look at pictures of Osla and Philip, she was on a par with him aesthetically. They were extraordinarily good looking in their youth. I mean, he was like a Hans Andersen fairy tale character, Philip. He was very, very good looking and had a thatch of blonde hair and a really good figure and was hugely self-possessed and a Greek prince, you know, who wouldn't want to have a quick snog. And Osla Benning certainly did. I don't know, I did a whole chapter on sort of sex before marriage or not, as the case may be. I think very posh debutante girls were, of course, incredibly paranoid about getting pregnant, because that would have totally ruined knocked them down the pecking order, as it were. So I'm not sure he'd have probably got his end away with dear Osla, but they certainly were very attached to each other. And for both, I think the relationship was impactful and significant even later on in their lives. You know, he was the godfather to one of her children, and he was the first man she fell in love with.
But he was quite ambitious, so that was never really going to be a prospect for marriage, is it? He's looking for someone a little bit more senior.
He's the Prince of Greece. Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing about Philip. Now, do we judge him for that? If I think, as a woman, you know...
Well, for me, Greece is above Britain in the importance stakes. So,
yes, but
to me, he married down.
Yeah, but not the Greek monarch particularly. They had a pretty roughshod ride, and they were sort of flirting with fascism before the war, and they were constantly being knocked off their throne.
Well, yeah.
Would actually be the royal family that you'd be most keenly associated with. And he was biffed away. I mean, he left Corfu a year, where he was born. His family were in exile a year after his birth. I mean, the British papers actually celebrated the fact that he couldn't speak Greek. That was how ridiculous. That's where we're parochial. Like, yeah. It was like, phew, it's okay. He's not really Greek. He doesn't even speak Greek. Yeah, back of the net. One for England there, boys. Oh, you know. And famously, although he lived in Paris after they were exiled, it was said when the Edinburghs, as Philip and Elizabeth were known when they got married, it was said that that Elizabeth spoke better French than Philip when they went on their tour of Paris. So languages weren't Philip's strength, which probably endeared him in some way to the British public. But no, he definitely lined up Elizabeth. Do we judge him for that? I mean, famously, women, we're always renowned, aren't we? And have been until recently, when we've been allowed to earn money of our own, you know, for choosing men not necessarily for the size of their pecker, but for the size of their pay pack. You know, that has historically been the burden of women. If you don't marry a rich husband, you're going to be poor for life, love. So Philip, if he didn't marry into a family that had a realm, he was going to be forever an exile prince, irrespective of whether he progressed in the navy. So I take my hat off for him for having foresight and for conveniently having a third cousin who was buxom and dutifully attractive, I think is how we could sum up Elizabeth. And I think we know that he was trying to secure his future, or future proofing, if you like, quite early in the war, because he was sending letters to Elizabeth, I think as early as 1941. Certainly his cousin Alexandra, the ex-queen of Yugoslavia, was like, why are you writing to Elizabeth? She's like a baby. She's like 14. So I think it must have been 1940, therefore. And he was like, oh, you know, she's my cousin. Oh, yeah, really, Philip? How many other third cousins are you writing to? Are you just securing Christmas at Windsor, which I'm sure he was trying to do, but you wouldn't go through a 14-year-old to secure your place at the Windsor Christmas table, would you? You'd go through cousin Marina or Uncle Mountbatten. Anyway, the point is that it was being...
He's playing a long game there, isn't he?
Yeah, he's playing a long game. Yeah, and he could afford to as a young man of about 20. All he had to do really was survive the war and be allowed to fight for Britain, which he was allowed to from 1940, joins the Navy. He then gets fully engaged in the war after Greece, of course, are implicated and the Germans take over Greece. And he has a pretty respectful war. He's mentioned in dispatches. He fights in the Pacific and in the Mediterranean. I don't know, if it didn't swing it for some in Britain, his war service, I think it helped. And certainly latterly, when the great generation emerged, this idea of the generation who fought for freedom, Philip was absolutely front and center. We saw that when he died. This was a man who, earned his stripes.
Well, he gave up what could have been quite a distinguished career, couldn't it?
Oh, I think too much is made of that.
Now that I wanted to ask if that was true. No, I'm
Philip.
glad you've right. So that's slightly exaggerated, is it?
Yeah. Well, okay. Can you name an admiral of the fleet, a head of the navy? Can you name one?
Well, I can name one from the late 18th century.
My point is the agency
but not post
Philip.
World War II. I
right.
struggle to.
But
Admiral Leach.
It was a rhetorical question, Ollie. Don't worry. You don't need to sink into a panic of how many high hegians from the Navy can I name. It was a rhetorical question. The point is the agency accorded to the Duke of Edinburgh once he had married Elizabeth was far greater than he would have ever achieved in the Navy. So was the sacrifice really that big? I'm not saying the path was hugely easy. I'm not saying there weren't spikes in the ground. They were all over the shop. But just that it wasn't a sacrifice. A woman, all women virtually in the 40s and 50s who are giving up anything they've acquired to go and have babies and part with some post-traumatically distressed man, for the next 50 years. Now that's a sacrifice, but don't get me started on Philip's sacrifice because I don't see it as one.
Okay, fair enough.
But I do think we can unpick, and let's make this a bit more contemporary and less dodgy than some of your podcasts. I think we can.
The history podcast.
I'm ribbing you. I listen avidly.
Do you?
I listened to the one who said 99% of my book is accurate. Or who was the guy who said 99% of my book is correct? Come on.
That's Mark
Second
Urban.
World War book.
Mark Urban.
Mark Urban. I love that comment because it's absolutely true. Don't read your audiobook, guys and girls. If you're a writer, or do if you want to go through a really thorough corrective process, because if you really want to know how you write, you have to read your audiobook. And if you really want to spot the typos when it's too late and your book's gone to print, again, I beseech you, read your audiobook. What I can't understand about publishers is why don't they get their act together so that the audiobook is read before the book's gone to print? I mean, it seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? Anyway, that's just a little aside for the writing community. In the meantime, let's go back to Philip and Elizabeth. So yeah, he was lining his nest, Philip, but I don't blame him for that. He was looking after his family himself, and I think in many respects there was love on both sides, not just for Elizabeth. We know she was cutting pictures of him out in her scrapbook when she was 13, 14, and from there on in, she had her eye absolutely steadfastly pinned to Philip.
At what point did
she wanted?
At what point did he sort of start asking her out for dinner and things like that?
Well, it's kind of challenging. These things are always challenging. Have you not watched the Harry and Meghan documentary? There isn't the freedom accorded to.
I have, unfortunately, yes.
You have, haven't you? Yeah.
Well, I gave up after midway through. I did make it to episode 3, but I gave up.
Did you? Well done. Gosh, I think that's further than I've got, but don't tell any of the programs in which I've been commentating. But the point is, I mean, they weren't as free. There is the compromise, the rub of royalty. They are in their gilded cage. You have to be careful. And as Stanley Baldwin had pointed out during the abdication crisis, it's not just any old marriage. Who the heir to the throne, or indeed the king, marries, or the queen, as Elizabeth has come, is a big deal. It is a matter of state. And therefore, Philip, so there's questions asked in 1941. Philip is intermittently on the scene. He goes for Christmas. I write about that. It's quite well covered.
And he writes a letter after Christmas? He writes a letter back saying, I'm very opinionated. He writes to the Queen mother. She wasn't the Queen mother then, she was the Queen. But says, I was very opinionated. Which is quite funny.
She didn't like him, the Queen Mother, the Queen Mother's family. I mean, that's the other thing that I was really riveted by in this book, the sort of mafiosa of Scottish aristocracy. God, I mean, they're a buggering lot. I tell you, I know because I grew up in Scotland. My dad was a factor on a large estate run by a laird. So I know all too well about the sort of clannishness of Scottish aristocrats. And that was where, in 1946, Philip goes, this is clocked by the press, incidentally, up he goes to Balmoral. And that is, thankfully, the Queen Mother slips in a burn, a stream, by the way, if you're English, that is, and twists her ankle. So she's kind of out of play, which means Philip suddenly is relieved from this a little pot of poison, which is how I think of the Queen Mother, because I think she was really a pretty formidable figure wrapped in a saccharine package, and was very doubtful about Philip. And the king is softer. He's worried about Elizabeth being too young. He's aware, and I was very aware, having written The Army Girls and knowing that Elizabeth had such a restricted war, locked up in Windsor Castle, having this very brief period in service when she couldn't even stay in the barracks and hang out with the prostitutes and lesbians. You know, she'd had this really cloistered time. And so her father was rightly worried that, you know, Philip, the be all and end all, and all sorts of courtiers were saying, you know, he's vulgar, he's German, and one actually writes, you know, and he's unlikely to be faithful. So there were serious concerns, but by that summer of 46, it's been mooted. And the king, of course, has to give his seal of approval if the heir to the throne's under 25, and he kind of signs it off, but it's not public. So he sort of says to Elizabeth and Philip, yeah, look, okay, but slowly. And then promptly announces this first ever tour to South Africa, or Southern Africa as it was then, without Philip, of course, and without any announcement in the press. In fact, there's another denial. There's about 7 denials in the press. There's another denial when the family, that us for the firm, go to South Africa, that there's any chance of a marriage, which is hurtful for Elizabeth. She doesn't really, this is her first time out of Britain. She doesn't leave Britain until she's 20. To go, because of the war, of course, to go on this tour. And she doesn't enjoy it as she should have done, because she wants to sew things up, get a man in the bag. He's a good looking bloke. You don't want him swanning around on his own for too long, for crying out loud. By this stage, of course, the war's over. He's back. I think he's in Wiltshire somewhere. But it's in the book, you know, in a greatcoat, you know, having a boring time on shore. Philip liked action. He was a classic sort of public schoolboy in that way. Pretended he wasn't vain, it's all about being tough, but actually was super vain. Used to go jogging in 3 jerseys to keep his weight down, avoided carbohydrates in later life to make sure that his waist remained the same size as it had been when he was 19. And he did, funnily enough. I know someone who met him in his early 90s, and it was a very frosty day at some weird point to point, you know, a classic upper class thing to do in January or wherever it was. And they said they were really struck that everyone else was sort of covered up in woolly hats and big puffers, but not Philip. He was sort of standing there in his shirt sleeves, you know, toughing the weather out. That was his own version of vanity. It was, you know, he was a player, was our Philip.
One woman in his life that I was interested in was the relationship with his mother, who was Princess Alice of Greece. And she had quite an interesting war, didn't she? In that she was in the convent, but had done this sort of hugely heroic act.
Yeah, and that was again the schizophrenia of Philip's family, where on the one side you have a whole bunch of them fighting for the Germans, and on the other side you got the mum who's totally confused as to why Philip's fighting in the British Navy. Why aren't you in the Greek one, darling? And I'm now in a 2-bedroom flat in Athens. Would you like to drop by? You know, she's a bit sort of, she makes an extraordinary recovery. She's in 2 sanatoriums for her mental health in the late 20s, 30s. That relationship breaks up, incidentally, obviously with her husband, who then is sort of a sybarite with never quite enough money on the Riviera, semi-depressed with a string of glamorous women, one of whom I think took proper care of him before he dies quite young in his 60s at the end of the war, towards the end of the war. So Philip, and I think Philip felt that as a loss, his father. People always imagined, oh, he had this, you know, terrible childhood and no real parents. But until his dying day, Philip said, no, I love my parents, you know, I love my father. Didn't really see very much of him. He wasn't a conventional father. But it was, again, that sort of, you know, early 20th century upper class detachment. But it didn't mean that there wasn't love. It just wasn't hugely demonstrable or conventional. But I think certainly it probably impacted on Philip in some ways, and definitely underlined the appeal of Elizabeth. If you've got this, you know, this very orthodox mother talking of, you know, the significance of Philip's faith, a committed woman, a charitable woman, someone who did save Jews and deeply care, and a father who had been a significant military player in Greece until he was forced into exile. I think, but this, the total lack of stability and the misery of exile for all royals. I mean, if you're royal and then you don't actually have any money or around, what is the point of you? And you can't just extinguish that entitlement. I don't think so, okay, we'll just become a plumber. You know, I'm a prince today, I'll be a plumber tomorrow, let's get on with it. It doesn't work like that when you've got this inbuilt genetic entitlement. You know, as Philip reminded people when they were being really rude to him in Buckingham Palace, you know, actually my grandmother was born in Windsor Castle, up yours type thing. He wouldn't have set up yours, by the way. But he was treated in a very disparaging fashion. And the press ran polls, should Elizabeth marry Philip? And that rattled the royal family. So this idea that now that the royal family are rattled by bad press, that they were rattled in the 1990s, that the Harry and Meghan saga was rattling them. They were rattled in the 40s and 50s. In fact, Philip made them more aware. He added the Sunday Pictorial and I think the Mirror to the list of newspapers that were read at Buckingham Palace. He felt they needed to broaden their reach.
I was just reading about that as well, actually, as I was skimming over the book again. He took in the Mirror.
Skimming, Ollie.
Yeah, well, I've read
you.
it, and then I
I'm ribbing you.
I had to reschedule this call. And I was reading it, and he had to take the Mirror, didn't he? So he's a Mirror reader.
He did.
He didn't strike as a Mirror reader. I think last time we spoke, we discussed that he was probably the Telegraph. I think for the cricket, and you think...
Yeah, for the sport, definitely loved the sport. The thing is, the Mirror was particularly skeptical about Philip. They actually ran a picture on their wedding day, 70 years ago last month, incidentally, their wedding. They ran a picture of Philip in Greek costume on the wedding day, just to underline this bloke's Johnny Foreigner, this little heft of xenophobia, lest Meghan Markle thinks she's special in the first. This has been going on for decades.
So if
and it's
I
not
read
entirely about race. I think it's more
a lovely
about
picture.
foreigners.
I think he looks wonderful
in that picture.
Yeah.
But they didn't put it on their front page to celebrate. No, they didn't. No, they're not all about Greek culture, peasant culture. That really wasn't what they were into. But I think in terms of the broader picture, I think Elizabeth married well in many respects. She married the man she loved. And I think we've seen recently how very difficult that is. I mean, Harry's just made the point in his Netflix docu-soap, hasn't he? That actually, certainly individuals in his family have previously married into a mold. Where Elizabeth's very lucky is that she genuinely fancies, nay loves, a man who is from the right mold. Once Britain get their head around he's Greek, but we get rid of the Greek tag anyway, this perfidious Balkan tag, then he's kind of cut out for the job because he believes in monarchy. And again, let's go to Meghan. I mean, there she is mocking the idea of curtsying the Queen. She simply doesn't believe in hereditary monarchy. She's American. She's a Black American. Why would we expect her to? But Philip was from a royal family, an exiled royal family. He had doubled down reasons to believe in monarchy.
Well, I think I don't think the Queen was particularly put out by that. Do you think that the Queen was affected by the whole Harry and Meghan thing? Because she's seen abdication, the war, her father dying very young. There have been a lot more important things that have happened than someone who's 7th or 8th in the line of the throne now.
Indeed, I don't think that she will have worried about it long-term rocking the monarchy. I think she knew that you just have to weather these storms because she had experienced enough of them. But I think she would have been sad about the breakdown of inter-family relations. I think any grandmother would. I mean, that's just on a human level, and we know that. It's kind of sad, isn't it? It's a bit like the Duke of Windsor estranging himself. And I think Elizabeth did what she could to make sure we didn't have a replica of the Duke of Windsor, whether he was totally persona non grata. I mean, Charles has, said, "Oh, we love Harry and Meghan." There's not been any of that kind of severance. Of course, the stakes aren't as high. As you said, Harry was never heir to the throne and was very unlikely that he was ever going to be.
The cut might come now, though, with this Netflix show, mightn't it?
I don't think so. I think it would make monarchy, British monarchy, look mealy-mouthed. I think they're a state institution. They've got a huge amount of backing, a lot of goodwill. I think it makes them look more broad-shouldered and generous if they just weather it out. They understand this is a couple in pain. Both had a lot of pain in their childhood. Both had stuff they needed to work through. They also need to understand that to run Montecito is very expensive. So if you're going to action on Mexit, if you're not going to let them have this kind of quasi status, then they are going to have to sell in stories. And the biggest story in town is, the biggest story in town is the Kardashians with the crown on, which is what Harry and Meghan look like. So let's see. But Philip and Elizabeth are a reminder of this was the last generation where not only did they 100% believe in marriage, and I don't believe that marriage has to be monogamous, but it's the institution of marriage is, again, like monarchy, a broad-shouldered institution. It can incorporate all sorts of wrongdoing, even infidelity, especially from that class and generation. but it's about enduring. It's about the front foot. It's about the facade in many respects. And then over marriage, and more important than marriage, and one of the reasons why marriage is important is in the service of monarchy. And both Elizabeth and Philip believe in marriage, and they believe because they believe ultimately in monarchy, and they know it helps preserve the monarchy. And having worked with a lot of their generation, that runs through all of them. It's like the center of a stick of rock, a belief in monarchy and a belief in marriage. In a way that our generation, we're more flexible. Are we more intolerant? We're certainly more transitory. There's less permanence. We don't believe in monarchy and marriage in the same way. And Charles's generation don't. Half of them got divorced, including Charles. He's a different kind of king. And actually, it doesn't matter how much future proofing we did during the death of the Queen. I say this in the book. You know, I think, I can't remember what I say in a book and what I say on a TV channel. But anyway, the point is that Charles is overseeing a much more divided Britain. When the Queen comes to the throne with Philip behind her, there's no question that there might be an independent Scotland or an independent Northern Ireland. The polling ratings for Charles in Scotland and Wales are less than 50% often. We don't talk about that in England, but it's true. The real success of monarchy, interestingly, is in England.
Well, in Northern Ireland recently, a poll has just come out that shows the support for the union is much higher than was originally anticipated. So I think
at least for the king.
It's not. No, it wasn't. It was more for the union rather than.
Right. I'm talking about actually Charles's ratings in Wales and Scotland, the monarchy's ratings,
right,
and not as high as we imagine them to be.
Interesting.
And yet, interestingly, the SNP have made it very clear they'd keep the monarchy.
But and what is, as a whole, what's the sort of support for monarchy now? Because I would have thought in the wake of the Queen's death, it's
just over 50% those who are positive or very positive, which leaves a lot of people.
Oh, I would have thought it'd be higher. That's not high.
No,
that's not as high as I thought it was.
It's not. But remember, the coverage of the Queen's death told half the narrative. Because we were remembering her, we were respecting her, we were revering her. It was reverential, the coverage. By definition, we didn't tap into the ambivalent or anti 45%.
So most people would agree that the Queen had a very successful reign, but is it successful if only just over half the country is in support? I mean, you know, if it was a successful reign, should it be much higher?
In my book, I argue that her real success is the brand of family monarchy that Philip and Elizabeth were the pin-ups for. You know, they were no longer politically powerful. This was the post-war era, and here they are as this family monarchy, both in Britain peddled as such, and also in the Commonwealth on their big tour and so forth in the early 50s. Now you could argue, well, family monarchy came crashing down, didn't it? What was the Margaret divorces, and then 3 of the siblings divorced, 3 of the children divorced. So is she successful? Her and Philip were successful. Was it possible for that model of marriage and that idea, that inflexible idea of marriage and monarchy to continue into this more flexible era? She as an individual was hugely successful, and we know that, and became so impressive because she was so old. Ditto Philip. There was certainly a fondness for Philip. I mean, there was a bit of a pushback when he died that there was too much coverage and stuff. But I think most of us thought, okay, he's a bit loudmouth, but we're fond of him, and he served in a way that is of their generation. Do we, you know, no longer is our consort ever going to, you can't say they won't have fought in a world war, but there isn't those unifying forms. Great Britain isn't such a unifying brand. We didn't have the baptism of fire that was the Second World War. It's a much harder gig for Charles and going forward for William. And also the British establishment, whether it's the press, the Fourth Estate, or our monarchy, is under attack in a way that people didn't envisage. Netflix, for instance, this whole hoo-ha with Harry and Meghan, they're not under the auspices of Ofcom.
Yeah, they're not bound, but any inaccuracies they don't have to correct, do they? Yeah,
and the problem is with I think with the monarchy, and this is one of the other things that I was very struck by writing the book, was the relationship between the conservative press and monarchy, and that one depends on the other. And that means that I think sometimes the monarchy hasn't been sufficiently scrutinized in the right way. Why don't they employ more ethnic minority people in, say, Buckingham Palace, in a city that's nearly half ethnic minority? Why not? Give me the answer for that. I think the Queen genuinely believes in the Commonwealth.
Well, I think the Commonwealth gives them a great opportunity to do that, doesn't it?
Which I don't think they've used properly. And yet Philip and Elizabeth were huge champions. But remember, the problem with monarchs who live for a very long time is your CEO is quite old-fashioned. The whole system was creaking because she was 96. New broom. And then the king's now so old, where's the new broom going to come from? He's 74. There's problems, but I think this high point, this extraordinary high point, and it was in many respects, and Philip resented this, the soap opera story, the love story, very good looking Elizabeth and Philip, peaches and cream, super young, wonderful coronation, a feminine figure supported by her very handsome war hero husband. We're not going to see the like of that again. That's, I think, where the outpouring came in September. And writing about them was like time travel. It was hard to believe this spanned one life.
They are very touching. Yes.
Are you just trying to finish the podcast though?
Well, no, because I know we're limited on time.
Have you enjoyed this podcast, Ollie?
Of course.
Is it more feminine? Is it taking you outside of your comfort zone?
Well, I spoke to Leander Delar last week, which was very good, all about Henrietta Maria. There's plenty of female input into this podcast. Did I sound a little bit defensive there?
You did, yeah. You sounded a bit like a member of the royal household saying no racists here. Moving along. Yes. Are you a relation of Lady Susie Hussey? Or is that too close to the bone? Anyway.
No relation whatsoever.
Thank you for talking to me. And
thank you for coming on. And the book, Elizabeth and Philip, fantastic book. Really,
it was actually one of your editorial picks. You might want to tell your.
It was one of my books of the year. I found the story on in particular Philip. I found Philip quite an interesting character. His upbringing, it's the Greek thing as well, always gets me. But an interesting individual.
Just quickly, they never, as a couple, once she was coronated, ever visited Greece. Is that about the Parthenon marbles? Who knows? They did visit Greece when they were the Edinburghs and he was serving in Malta. Because when I was covering the Queen and I was in Sky in September, this Greek girl said, I don't like your Queen. And I said, oh, why not? Suddenly got all defensive. It's like, I can slag off the Queen because she's mine, but you can't. And I said, oh, why not? And they said she never visited Greece. And I said, I think you'll find actually she did. I think it was the late 1940s or 1950.
Well done.
Visited, and she was totally gobsmacked. She Googled it. She was like, oh my goodness, you actually know what you're talking about. Goes back to what I say about royal experts, in inverted commas. Anyway, on that note, all my love, thank you very much for according the book some attention. It's been a little bit overshadowed by Giles Brandreth, who professes to be a friend of Philip and Elizabeth. But I think one can't always write the most honest biography if one is a friend.
I agree. We should read historians' books.
Indeed. On that note, happy Christmas.
As I mentioned at the start, do have a look at Aspects of History's Books of the Year. Link in the show notes, including, of course, Tessa's. We've got plenty of authors in there, including many friends of the show giving their recommendations. More great history is coming up, including bonus specials and episodes to tide you over until the new year. In January, for the anniversary, we'll be talking about the trial and execution of Charles I. In the meantime, thank you and good night.